The day my mother called my husband a liability to this family. He was standing right next to me. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at her with those calm, steady eyes and said, "I understand." And somehow that made her angrier than anything else could have. I think about that moment a lot. How a man who had every reason to fight back just didn't. And how that quietly broke something in my mother that she's never been able to put back together. My name is Sloane. I'm 31 years old, and for most of my life I believed that love meant earning it. That's what growing up in my family taught me. Not in obvious ways. We weren't a household that screamed or threw things. My parents were far too composed for that. What they gave instead was silence. A particular kind of silence that arrived whenever you did something they didn't approve of. Heavy, purposeful. Designed to make you feel like you'd failed some exam you hadn't known you were taking. My father is a federal judge. Has been since I was 12. Before that, he was a prosecutor, the kind that made the evening news. My mother never worked. Not because she couldn't, but because she believed that managing a household at their level was its own full-time career. And she wasn't entirely wrong. The dinner parties she organized, the charity board she sat on, the connection she maintained like a gardener, tending very expensive roses, it was all labor, just labor that nobody put on a resume. I was their only child, which meant I carried all of it. All the expectation, all the projection, all the careful, curated hope for what my life was supposed to look like. By the time I finished law school at 25, I had done everything right. Not everything I wanted. Everything I wanted. Those two things had stopped feeling like the same thing somewhere around my sophomore year of college, but I'd pushed that thought down so many times it had stopped surfacing on its own. I passed the bar on my first attempt. I clerked for a federal appellate judge, a colleague of my father's, naturally. I wore the right clothes to the right events and laughed at the right moments. And dated a man named, well, I called him what my parents called him, the right kind of person. He was an attorney at a white shoe firm downtown, third-generation Ivy League. His family had a house on the Cape that had been in their name since the 1940s. My parents loved him. Of course they did. He fit the blueprint so precisely he might have been commissioned from it. I didn't love him. I tried. I really did. There's something humiliating about trying to fall in love with someone, like forcing yourself to find a painting beautiful when all you feel standing in front of it is nothing. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on New Year's Eve at a restaurant my father had specifically suggested, and I said yes because the alternative was a conversation I didn't yet have the courage to have. I broke off the engagement 4 months later. I told my parents it was mutual. It wasn't. He was blindsided, and I still feel badly about that. He deserved better than someone who was trying to love him and failing quietly the whole time. What I didn't tell my parents, what I didn't tell anyone, not at first, was why. His name was Joel. Joel Decker. I met him at a PT clinic 8 months earlier when I tore a ligament in my knee during a company 5K that I'd only signed up for because it looked good. He was the physical therapist's assistant who did my intake evaluation. He was 29, from a small town in western Pennsylvania, and he had absolutely no idea who my father was. That last part was more refreshing than I can properly explain. Joel had grown up working. Not the way people say I worked hard when they mean they studied diligently and competed for prestigious internships. I mean, his father drove a delivery truck, and his mother worked the early shift at a grocery store, and Joel had been bagging groceries himself from the time he was 15 to help cover utilities when things got tight. He'd gone to a state school on a combination of scholarships and loans, gotten his degree in kinesiology, and was working toward his full PT license while taking night classes twice a week. He was the most unassuming person I had ever met. He talked about his work with this quiet enthusiasm, like helping someone regain mobility after an injury wasn't just a job. It was actually something he thought about. He remembered his patients' names, their goals, the specific things they said they wanted to be able to do again. He told me once that a 72-year-old woman had cried at her last session because she could finally get down on the floor to play with her granddaughter. And the way he said it, I could tell he'd thought about that moment more than once since it happened. I started coming to my appointments earlier than I needed to. By the time my knee had healed, we had exchanged numbers. 3 months after that, we were having dinner twice a week. 4 months after that, I broke an engagement. I know how that sounds. And I want to be clear, I didn't leave my ex because of Joel. I left because I had finally gotten honest with myself about what I'd been doing. And what I'd been doing was performing a life rather than living one. Joel just made me see the difference. Standing next to someone who was completely, uncomplicatedly himself showed me how much effort I had been putting into being someone I wasn't. I didn't tell my parents about him for 6 months. Not because I was ashamed of him, I want to say that clearly, but because I was protecting what we had from an evaluation it wasn't ready for. When you grow up in a household where love comes with conditions, you learn to keep the things that matter close until they're sturdy enough to survive exposure. When I finally told my mother, I kept it simple. I was seeing someone. His name was Joel. He was a physical therapist. She asked where he'd gone to school. I told her. There was a pause. Not a long one, just long enough to mean something. Is it serious? She asked. Yes, I said. Another pause. We should have dinner, she said in the tone she used when she was gathering information. That dinner was the beginning of a very long year. My parents were not cruel to Joel. I want to be precise about that, because cruelty would have been easier to name and easier to fight. What they were was politely, methodically diminishing. My father asked him questions about his career trajectory and the voice he used to cross-examine witnesses. Not aggressive, but structured in a way that made the answers feel like they were falling short. My mother spoke to him with a warmth that stopped just before it became genuine. The social equivalent of a room temperature handshake. At one point, my father said, "It's admirable, the work you do. These community health roles are so important." He said it the way someone might compliment a middle school science fair project. Joel thanked him. He meant it. That was the thing about Joel. He didn't have a performance mode. He was just himself at every table in every room. My parents interpreted that as a lack of sophistication. I had started to understand it as a kind of freedom I'd been trained not to recognize. After dinner, my mother pulled me into the kitchen while Joel and my father sat with coffee in the living room. She didn't waste time. "He's very sweet," she said. "He is," I said. "Sloane." She set down the dish she was holding. "You have worked so hard. Your father has worked so hard. There is a version of your life that is." She paused, choosing words commensurate with that. "With who you are and what this family stands for." "Joel's commensurate with who I am," I said. She looked at me the way she looked at arguments she'd already decided to reject. "He's not in your world." "Then maybe I want a different world," I said. We didn't fight. That wasn't how we fought. She went back to being gracious, and I went back to the living room, and Joel caught my eye across the room and gave me a small, questioning look, and I shook my head slightly, and he nodded. And that small exchange, that shorthand we'd already built, felt more like home than anything in that house. We got engaged 14 months after I broke off my first engagement. Joel asked me on a Sunday morning in our apartment. No restaurant, no orchestrated setting, just the two of us and coffee getting cold on the counter because neither of us wanted to stop talking. The ring was simple. He'd saved for it. I loved it more than any piece of jewelry I'd ever owned. My parents' response, when I called them that evening, was a silence so specific I could have bottled it. "We'll need to sit down and talk about this," my mother said. We sat down and talked about it the following Saturday. My father did most of the talking. He was measured, which was worse than if he'd been heated. He talked about legacy and about what it meant to build something across generations and about the importance of alignment between partners. He never said Joel's name once in 40 minutes. At the end, he looked at me and said, "We just want what's best for you." I said, "I know. I think we disagree about what that is." My mother said almost quietly, "If you do this, Sloane, you need to understand that there are consequences. Not from us, from the life you're choosing to leave behind." I thought about that sentence for a long time afterward, the particular architecture of it. Not from us. As though they were bystanders to whatever was coming. We planned the wedding largely on our own. I had imagined, naively, that as the date got closer, something would shift. That my parents' love for me, whatever form it took, would eventually outweigh their disappointment. I'd heard that story before. I believed in it the way you believe in things you need to be true. What actually happened was that my mother called me 3 weeks before the wedding. She had found out that Joel's family was hosting a small pre-wedding dinner at their home in Pennsylvania. Nothing formal, just close family on both sides meeting for the first time. She had been invited. She was calling to tell me she and my father would not be attending. It's a long drive, she said. I let that sit for a moment. It's 4 hours, Mom. Your father has obligations that weekend. I told you about this dinner 2 months ago. I asked you to keep that weekend. Sloane, are you coming to the wedding? I asked. A pause. We haven't decided. I hung up. I don't know if I've ever felt more alone in a moment that was supposed to be happy. They came to the wedding. I want to be honest about that. They showed up. My mother wore a pale gray dress that was one shade removed from the color of disapproval. They sat in the front row because they were my parents, and I hadn't yet accepted that I needed to protect myself from them at my own wedding. They didn't cry. My mother smiled the way she smiled at things she was enduring. At the reception, I watched my mother-in-law, a woman who had driven a school bus for 22 years and had Joel's laugh and his way of actually listening when you talked, dance with my father-in-law to a song from 1987 that was clearly their song. And I had to look away because something about it cracked me open. My father gave a toast. It was technically gracious. Sloane has always known her own mind, he said, which in a different context would have been a compliment. Joel's best friend from childhood gave a toast that was 3 minutes of him telling a story about Joel spending his entire savings at 22 to help a coworker cover a medical bill, then laughing it off as no big deal. Half the room was crying. Joel was staring at the table, trying not to cry. I was not trying at all. 3 days after we got back from our honeymoon, my mother called. She had seen the photos. Not the photos from the wedding photographer. Those hadn't come back yet. Someone had posted photos to social media, candid ones. Our first dance. My mother-in-law and I hugging in the parking lot before the ceremony because I'd started crying and she'd appeared from nowhere with a tissue. Joel and his younger brother doing something ridiculous during the bouquet toss. You looked happy, my mother said in a tone that made happiness sound faintly suspicious. I was happy, I said. His family is very, she paused. Warm? They are. Another pause. I hope you know what you're doing. I do, I said. Probably better than I've known anything. The conversation that actually changed everything happened 11 months after the wedding. It wasn't one dramatic moment. It was a dinner. My parents' house, a Sunday, the kind of dinner where the good china comes out and the conversation is always angled toward something. Joel came with me. He always came with me. He never complained, never made me feel like showing up for my parents was a burden he resented. He just put on a collared shirt and drove and made easy conversation about whatever came up, and I knew that cost him something even when he didn't say so. My mother had invited a couple for dinner. They introduced themselves as colleagues of my father's, a partner at a law firm and his wife. What took me about 4 minutes to understand was that the wife was the older sister of the man I'd been engaged to before Joel. This was not an accident. My mother did not do accidents. She was pleasant about it. She asked about his work, laughed at his jokes, touched her husband's arm in a way designed to make every gesture feel pointed without being provable. At one point, she turned to Joel and said, with a smile that didn't reach the corners, "It must be so rewarding, your work. Really giving back?" Joel said yes, it was. She said, "And you're still working toward your license?" Emphasis so light you'd miss it if you weren't listening for it. "Got it last year," Joel said. He said it pleasantly, no edge, and went back to his food. But the moment that I have replayed more than any other came after dinner. My mother and I were in the kitchen. The guests were in the living room. Joel was helping my father carry dishes in, which he did every time without being asked, which my mother had never once acknowledged. She said, "He's not going to grow, Sloane." I turned around. Men like that, they find their level and they stay there. That's not a criticism. It's just how it works. You're going to wake up in 10 years and realize you've been carrying the weight of this family alone. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about all the things I could say. I thought about the Sunday morning with the cold coffee and the simple ring. I thought about Joel at my parents' dining room table making easy conversation year after year, never asking for acknowledgement he was never going to get. I thought about what my mother had just said to a couple whose last name she'd been friendly with for 30 years. About a man she barely knew. "I think you should know something," I said. I took out my phone. I had received an email 4 days earlier that I hadn't yet told Joel about because I was still processing it myself. I pulled it up and handed it to my mother. It was from the director of a regional nonprofit that provided physical rehabilitation services to underserved communities across 3 states. Joel had been quietly working with them for 2 years as a volunteer clinician, driving out on weekends, no pay, no recognition. Because there was a shortage of licensed PTs willing to go to rural areas where patients had no other options, the director had written to tell him that the organization was expanding, that they'd received a significant federal grant, and that they wanted Joel to come on as their clinical director. Full salary, benefits, a team of 12 under him, program expansion across 5 states. My mother read it. She read it twice. "This," I said, taking my phone back, "is the man you just called a liability to this family." She handed me the phone without speaking. I walked back into the living room. Joel was laughing at something my father had said. He looked up when I came in, that small questioning look again, and I shook my head again, and he nodded again. We left 40 minutes later. In the car, I showed him the email and told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wasn't keeping score." "I know," I said. "Those dinners were never going to be easy," he said. "I know that too." He drove for another mile or so. Then, "Do you want to keep going?" And I knew he meant the dinners, the effort, the sustained attempt to stay connected to my parents. Not the marriage. The marriage wasn't a question. "I think I need some time," I said. He reached over and put his hand over mine on the console. That was all. My mother called the next morning. She called again that evening. She called 3 more times over the following week, each voicemail shorter than the last and more carefully worded. My father called once, which was notable. He was not a man who made calls to smooth things over. In his message, he said, "Your mother and I have been reflecting. We haven't been fair to him, and I think we owe you both an honest conversation." I listened to that message 4 times. We went back. Not right away. I needed the distance to be real before I could let it close. But we went back. And the dinner that followed was different in ways I don't quite know how to describe. My father asked Joel actual questions about the new role, about what the work meant to him, about the communities he'd be serving. My mother was quieter than usual. When she refilled Joel's coffee without being asked, I watched her do it and understood it was as close to an apology as she knew how to give. It wasn't a transformation. I'm not going to tell you that everything shifted and my parents became different people. What shifted was more modest and maybe more real than that. They stopped pretending Joel was a phase. They started treating my life like it belonged to me. I still think about what Joel said in the car that night. I wasn't keeping score. It took me a long time to understand what he meant. He didn't mean he hadn't noticed. He meant he decided it wasn't the right thing to measure, that the life we were building together was worth more than the running tally of who had been unfair and how often. I grew up in a house where love was scored, where approval was the currency and you were always either earning or spending it. I didn't know there was another way until I watched someone live it right in front of me. This past spring, Joel's program served its 2,000th patient. He came home that evening and told me the way he'd tell me anything, quietly, matter-of-factly, like it was just the next thing that had happened. I made him a cake. It said 2,000 and slightly uneven frosting because I am not a skilled cake decorator and I refused to apologize for that. My mother called that night to check in. When I told her why we were celebrating, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's something to be proud of." She meant him. It was the first time. I don't know what my life would look like if I'd stayed on the path my parents built for me. Some version of comfortable, some version of correct, but I know it wouldn't have looked like this. Like a Sunday morning with cold coffee and a man who doesn't keep score, in an apartment that actually feels like home. Some people need to see the photograph before they can understand what was standing right in front of them. My parents needed 11 months and an email. I'll take it. I used to think the hardest thing about growing up in my family was the pressure, the expectations. The constant, unspoken exam I was always either passing or failing. But looking back now, I think the hardest thing was actually simpler than that. It was learning to trust what I knew to be true when everyone around me was telling me I was wrong. Joel never asked my parents to like him. He never performed, never argued, never tried to climb into a version of himself they would have found acceptable. He just showed up year after year and was exactly who he was. And for a long time, I thought that was just his personality, that quiet steadiness. Eventually, I understood it was something he had chosen, a decision he made and kept making. Every Sunday dinner, every loaded silence, every gracious question from my father that wasn't really a question at all. That's what I mean when I say integrity isn't a feeling. It's a practice. Joel didn't have some effortless inner peace that made those dinners easy. He had a clear sense of what mattered to him and what didn't. And he'd made a decision about which category my parents' approval fell into. That clarity, the kind you actually live by rather than just talk about, is something I'd never seen modeled before. My family had values. They just mostly applied them to other people. There's a kind of intelligence that has nothing to do with degrees or professional titles. Joel had it. He could read a room, understand what was being said underneath what was being said, and choose, deliberately choose, not to take the bait. When my mother introduced her friend and her pointed little smiles at that dinner, he answered politely and went back to his food. Not because he didn't notice, because he'd already decided that wasn't the arena he was competing in. That kind of judgment, knowing which battles are worth your energy and which ones are just someone else's need to feel superior, is rare. I grew up surrounded by educated people and I didn't see it once until I met him. And then there's what he built quietly, while my parents were busy deciding he wasn't worth knowing. 2 years of weekend drives to rural clinics where patients waited months for care. No recognition, no career leverage, no mention of it at any of our dinners. He wasn't building a reputation. He was just doing what he thought was right, because he thought it was right. That's the kind of persistence that doesn't come from ambition. It comes from something quieter and harder to manufacture. I think about the cause and effect of it all. My parents built a life around status and influence, and what it got them was a daughter who spent years performing happiness and a son-in-law they almost never knew. Joel built a life around showing up honestly for the people in front of him, and what it got him was 2,000 patients served, a team of 12, and a marriage that actually feels like rest. The email didn't change who Joel was. It just made it harder for my parents to keep pretending they hadn't been looking at him wrong. I'll take that.